Good evening. I will now call the April 25th, 2023 meeting of the Ben Lapine School Board of Directors to order. I would like to introduce our participants this evening. To my immediate left, Vice Chair Marcus LeGrand, Director Amy Tatum, Director Keena Chadwick, Director Carrie McPherson Douglas, Director Shamiko Montgomery, and Director Shirley Olson. To my immediate right is Superintendent Stephen Cook, Deputy Superintendent Laura Nordquist, and Board Clerk Janet Bojanowski. I am Melissa Barnes-Delakia, Chair of the Board. We are joined by Erin Trimble and Kayla Celadon tonight for ASL interpretation, and Spanish interpretation of the work session is being provided on the BLS School Board YouTube page. Make sure to click on the Live tab. All right. We will now go to item number 2, the Pledge of Allegiance. I invite you to stand, take off your hats, and join me.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll now move to the review of the agenda. Superintendent Cook, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Fellow board members, are there any changes to the agenda? Hearing no requests for changes to the agenda stands as noticed. And then a note for our stakeholders, we do not take public comment during our work sessions. It's an opportunity for the board to engage in discussion and really dig into our board work and our initiatives. We do take public comment at all of our regular board meetings. We'll now move into item number 4, our work session, and we will be led today by Dave Van Loo, the Director of School Improvement. So I'll hand it over to you, Dave.
All right, thank you. Good evening. I am happy to be here again. Let's just see if I can get the remote working. There we go. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about board end number 3. So we talked about board end 1, academic or strong academic foundation in December. I think we talked about board end 2, passion, purpose, and plan in February. And so this is the third one, wellness, inclusion, and belonging. And I think it's a good time to take a minute and just kind of pause on where we've been as a district with this. This slide actually shows that we've had ends like this for years, 6, 7, 8 years probably. So on the top there, you see what the old ones are. Academic excellence, future ready, thriving citizens. The new ones, strong academic foundation, passion, purpose, and plan, and wellness, inclusion, and belonging. I guess one of the big things to take away from this is they're really not that different. I think the new measure, the names are a little bit better, and the measurements are definitely better than what we used to have. But the big ideas of these really have stayed true throughout the years. And so that's part of the reason the pre-reading that you had was a really good, I think, just reflection on how each of these ends really are not separate things. They're really closely linked to each other. And when you think about them, if you picture them maybe being like a Venn diagram, the circles are going to overlap much more than they will be their own unique thing. So like in the reading, one of the things that they talked about was student-teacher relationships. And I think if you remember the triangle from, I think it was Eddie M. Stembridge's Cultural Responsive Teaching book, the idea that the foundation for strong student-teacher relationships is content. It's like that everyone can read the room and knows that that's got to be, you have to have effective teaching in this equation to have a really strong student-teacher relationship. I think the same thing can be said about belonging. I mean, belonging depends a great deal on the types of environments we create, but it depends just as much on students' perceived competence and their actual competence in being able to be successful every single day when they're at school in every single class. So I think I just want us to not ever forget that even though tonight we're trying to slice this wellness, inclusion, and belonging aspect to this, anytime we're talking about any one of these, we're talking about all three of these, and it's fiction to think that we can really separate one and just focus on one without addressing the others. And I think what we've seen in the past in some of our school improvement plans was a tendency, well-intentioned, but there was some siloing that would happen. So a school might have a team working on academic excellence and a team working on like wellness, inclusion, and belonging, and doing completely separate work. And so it's really important that, again, we're cognizant that these are really closely related. Two buttons here. So board goal 3, wellness, inclusion, belonging. We talked about bias incidents and shared those data previously, so we won't do that tonight. Tonight, the focus is going to be on 3A, student, family, and staff experiences, including voice, belonging, and emotional and psychological wellness. And we're gonna focus specifically on student and family youth truth data. I won't say too much about this. This is the same demographic slide we've looked at with each of the other ends. And in the past, I talked a lot about the free and reduced lunch issue, but we aren't really gonna dig into that specifically tonight. I can't remember if it was a year or two ago, I think I also shared this when we started looking at our youth truth data. This is something actually that Youth Truth Organization shared with us, and we found it really helpful, and we've actually had schools use this as well when they're rolling it out. This ladder of inference, the idea is we want to try to stay in the inquiry phase of analyzing data tonight and not move up the ladder too fast to thinking about actions or advocacy. So the way this image works is down at the bottom, you've got that pool of observable data. So that's basically all the data that could possibly be out there anywhere. There's no way we can pay attention to all of that. I mean, a biological example would be like your retinas can send something like 10 million bits of data per second to your brain. Well, there's way more data there than your brain is ever going to be able to comprehend. So we have to find ways to manage that. So from this broad pool, we will select specific observations. And from those observations, we'll focus on specific things to pay attention to. Whatever we pay attention to, then we try to add meaning to it. We start to make assumptions based on the meaning we ascribe to it. We draw conclusions based on those assumptions. Those in turn impact our beliefs and what we think the world is like, and those beliefs lead to actions. And as we move up that ladder, then we get to the top, and when we go back down to the bottom of this, everything that we've done and what we've learned and think we've learned and the beliefs we've adopted then impact what data we select from the observations the next time around. So we know that people just, they go through this, we go through this, everyone does thousands of times a day. It's evolutionary, it's baked into us, but I think it's a really good opportunity for us to just remember that if we stop and slow down and really focus and think about trying to look for things that we may not normally be paying attention to when we're trying to look at data. Data might be neutral, but people typically are not, so it takes work to do that. So the themes that we're looking at tonight, the student survey, there are what's called core themes. Those are the standard question in every Youth Truth survey that anyone in the country or in the world, frankly, would take. Those are engagement, academic challenge, relationships, belonging and peer collaboration, culture, and then at high school you have college and career readiness. We also do a couple of additional add-on themes. So we've done inclusion for the last 3 years. New this year, we selected the student voice and leadership, which was a new option for us, but we thought the theme really tapped into some of the things that we wanted to get at in our measurements. The one thing worth calling out here is relationships. That is specific to student-teacher relationships, whereas belonging and peer collaboration will get at the student-to-student types of relationships. For the family survey, it's a lot of the same themes. Engagement, culture, relationships. Family also answers questions about communication and feedback, how schools are resourced, and school safety. And then we do the additional theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion as well with families. As I said, we've done this for 3 years. What I'm showing here is basically an executive summary of the last 2 years. I skipped the first year, 2021. Because we did it in January, and we were right in the throes of virtual learning or kids coming right back into school. And so people were taking this, and kids either hadn't been in school yet or had been in school for like a week or two. So this is 2 years worth of data, and the thing that'll jump out here is there isn't a lot of change. The highest rated themes have tended to be the highest rated themes, and for the most part, that was true in the first year as well. The lowest rated themes haven't changed a whole lot either. And one of the things you might notice is that the lowest rated themes are really focused on kind of the academic and engagement end of this. And those are the pieces of the puzzle that we're not going to go as deeply into tonight, because we talked about those when we talked about board ends 1 and 2. For families, it's the same thing, and the consistency is pretty hard to miss. Relationships and culture are the things that across all the different levels consistently get the highest ratings. And the lowest rated themes tend to be around engagement and communication and feedback. So what you see here are 3-year trends for our middle and high school students. So middle school is the first column, and high school is the one that's further on the right. The orange box signifies the measures, the themes that we're actually going to look at tonight. So we're talking about culture, belonging and peer collaboration, relationships, student voice and leadership, and then inclusion. And a pretty fair summary of this is, for the most part, you see a downward trend at both levels across most of the different measures coming from students. From the family side, the data are a little bit different, I guess, and we also have elementary here. So we do elementary and middle and high school families. One of the things that's interesting here is with engagement, there's a clear dip in the second year. And again, data don't tell us why the data say what they do. My hypothesis would be schools were working really hard to keep people away from the buildings at that point in time. So it stands to reason that engagement would be lower. But in this year, we've certainly seen a rebound from what that looked like. Another trend that you can pick up here is there was a pretty big increase in communication and feedback at the elementary level. And I know that's been a discussion that's come up each of the last 2 years, or the prior years when we were looking at this data. So, I mean, my hypothesis would be that schools have started to focus on that a bit more at the elementary level. School safety, there's a clear downward trend across all the different levels, across all the different years. And finally, diversity and equity inclusion, there's a pretty clear upward trend for all of those. And it's safe to say that that has been a focus and a priority for a lot of our work in the district. So it stands to reason that that work is starting to potentially pay off in some of the feedback that we're getting from families. So who took the survey? This is showing our student participation for a few of our different key demographic groups. So POC is short for person of color. So you have at the middle and high school level students who identify as a person of color, not as a person of color, or there's a third category of prefer not to say. And so for each of these, you see the raw number of respondents, the percentage of respondents for that row. So in the top row, 15% and 71% and 13, that's 100%. So you had about the same number of students, same percentage of students identifying as persons of color and also preferring not to say on that question. So when you broadly look at these, especially for the traditional historically underserved groups, the participation we get from students looks very commensurate to what our population is, which is something that I guess we're happy about. I did highlight here in blue the middle school special ed. And the reason I highlighted that is the 24% of respondents chose another response other than I do receive special ed services or I do not receive that. And we have no way of knowing why they chose that, but it's notable that twice as many students responded something other than identifying into one of those two groups. And looking at the national data, the same thing tends to happen with special ed. So it's not unique to us. It's just something about the way the questions are worded or something about students' perceptions nationally around their special ed services. From family representation, it's a little bit more complex, I think. At the top, we have free and reduced. Then we have persons of color. We have the primary language at home, either Spanish, English, or another language. And then we have LGBTQ. And again, these are families identifying, not families identifying their students in the schools.
Dave?
So it would be parents who identify as LGBTQ or as Spanish speaking.
Dave, can I ask a quick question before we go to the families on that student representation? You gathered that information on GPAs, which definitely looks like our more successful students, academically successful students, were more likely to complete the survey. And I'm just wondering if you or Superintendent Cook, or I don't know who, has kind of a snapshot of what grade distributions look like overall in our system.
So actually, good question. The another response is going to be the C's and D's and some others. So proportionately about, I think that looks fairly accurate to what our actual grade distribution is. About 50% of our kids are in the A range, about 30% would be in about the B range, and 20% would be lower than that. Okay, back to family representation. The yellow cells basically just indicate that the response rate for that group or for that line was 5% or less. It's a really small N, so it's an area where we want to start to be cautious. Compounding that are the blue cells. You can see that for some of these where, for example, a person of color, you have about 3 times as many people who prefer not to answer that question as who identify into one of those groups. And again, we have no hard data telling us, so who are the people who are choosing not to identify into those groups? So, I think we have to make some inferences about why we think that might be. And there's a lot of things that could be going on. It's pretty interesting. The survey is very clear that it's completely anonymous. So people do know that when they have the opportunity to take it. But for both the persons of color and the LGBTQ, there's a really sizable contingent that prefers not to say. And I think that will affect how we interpret the data potentially.
On that, if I'm remembering correctly, on that family representation question, when families completed the survey, they were completing their own race or ethnicity, not their child's. Correct? Okay.
Okay, so don't stress out about this. What I've tried to do here, basically I've created what's called like a heat map. What this does is it distills probably dozens of different charts that we would have to sift through into one manageable table. So I'm going to just talk us through some of the key aspects of this. What I've tried to do here is in Youth Truth, we get scores or percentiles for each of these different measures or each of these different themes, but we don't get anything that's kind of like an overall composite. Like if you picture when students take the ACT, you get a reading score and an English score and a math score and a science score, and then they generate a composite that's kind of an overall summary of how well you did. I did the same thing to these data. Actually, the same complex approach that ACT uses of just like adding up all the percentiles and then finding out what the average is. So how these data are sorted are based on the average percentile rank nationally for that level. So on the left side, you're gonna see the lowest average percentile, the sum of all the sum of all these scores. Over to on the right is gonna be the highest ratings. And so that's that yellow box that says average percentile. That's how they're ordered from left to right. The blue cells actually show the gap between what would be considered a traditionally historically underserved group and their not historically underserved counterpart. So you would compare special ed to general ed. You would compare ELL to not ELL, or LGBTQ to not LGBTQ. And with grades, I just used A's as the clearly not historically underserved. So GPAs of B's and C's and D's are all being compared to students who self-identify as getting A's. So you can see basically the magnitude of the gaps are in the blue cells. Any of the green cells tend to be in the typical to average to above average range. Kind of that neon limey green would be above the 75th percentile. The lightest green is gonna be more between the 25th and 50th percentile. And a reasonable way to think about typical or average is the middle 50% of scores. So if you're from like the 25th percentile to the 74th percentile, you're kind of in the typical range of where most students fall. Then the pinker colors are below average, and then the really more pronounced magenta is those are percentiles that are in the bottom 10%. Again, all of these percentages or percentiles are compared to the national Youth Truth data, which now is well over 2 million students are in the data set. So it's a pretty robust data set. Are there any questions about how this is displayed? Because this is what you're gonna dig into.
Yeah, I need to be sure I understand the gap. Since it goes halfway, if you will. The first half are the scores that would be the underserved categories, right? Okay, and then the others would be, are all students, not this, not that, whatever.
Yep, so the gap is always under the group that would be considered traditionally historically underserved. So if you look at ELL at the middle school level, so the top chart, it's negative 13 or minus 13. So if you go over to the not ELL group, their average percentile for all of these measures was 62, or 63, excuse me, the not ELL group. The ELL group was 50, so it's just simple 63 minus 50, the size of the gap is 13.
Yeah, got it.
What other questions do you have?
Can I just emphasize the importance of the gap? Because we're not just looking at students depending on their demographic compared to either all students or some other external benchmark. But the gap, I just wanted to emphasize that the gap emphasizes how well some students are doing and how poorly others are. And that's a big, it's a big indicator of how students are experiencing, these different themes within school.
Yep, no, that's a great comment. And again, we try to do that's intentional. When we talk about gaps, we want to know the true size of the gap. So again, oftentimes you'll compare a student group to the all students group, but that group that you're looking at is also in the all students group, so it tends to underestimate the size of the gap. So here the all students group is there, so you're able to see both of those comparisons. Any different demographic group to the all students, as well as any different demographic group to kind of the opposite of that group.
Are those non-answers that we just looked at, or other answers that were not one or the other, yes or no? Those
So-
really can't be calculated in here, correct?
Correct.
And they're relatively small, even though there were a couple that were double what we considered the population, right?
Yep. Now,
Okay.
those would all be in like, say, the all students or all families group, but it wouldn't be in any of the subgroup-specific data.
And I have a little bit of question about the assumption that all A kids, kids with all As would not be in some of the other groups. I do think, is that where it's coming from? Is that right?
Yeah, so good question. Everything up here is student self-identification. So they ask them questions, what type of grades do you get? Do you identify with such and such a group? So there is no assumptions made at all about students being in 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 of these groups at the same time. So you absolutely have students who are double or triple. They're in
Yes.
many of these columns all at once. And again, because the survey is completely anonymous, we would have no way to look at more, I guess, data intersectionality of different groups unless Youth Truth was actually providing us those data, and we don't get those data.
So you don't even get the individual level anonymized, so you can't like do that correlation yourself.
We can't look at, they don't say, so here's all the responses from this anonymous student all linked together. No.
Dave, there would be some consideration. There's a lot to understand here, obviously. But I really do want to lay this next to the student achievement data because we have disaggregated that data also. And while we might not be able to do a one-on-one correlation, I think that some of the trends might show. And that's going to take a little doing. But just visually, I think we could take a look at that with the achievement data, and it might help us make some assumptions or answer some questions.
And you do have a proxy for achievement data in the self-reported GPAs as well. Students are, I would say, quite astute at knowing about what type of grades that they get. So, all right, excellent questions, thank you. So there are 2 questions that you're gonna reflect on related to these data. And you actually have a hard copy of this in front of you, so you can write on it, take notes, circle, highlight. You also, I believe, have a hard copy of the definitions of all of the different themes. So it's like, what was engagement again, or what was, I guess we're not looking at engagement, but culture per se. So you have that you can refer back to. But the 2 questions that you'll reflect on are, 1, what potentially important information do you see in these data? So there's a couple of things I would point out there. The question isn't what's interesting, the question isn't what's unusual, the question is what's potentially important. And potentially is important to this because feel free to take some risks. I mean, we don't necessarily know if everything is or isn't important, but if it's something that could be important, it's worth calling out. And then the second question is, what implications might this information have for the work of the school board? So keeping it very specific to your roles and responsibilities and such in our system. So I was thinking I'll probably just set a timer for 5 minutes for this first one and give you a chance to dig in. And then if we need more time, we can take more time, or if not, then we can kind of report out what we found.
Dave, do you know the sample size for the transgender? Okay. Okay, thanks.
There we go.
So I want to step into engagement and academic challenge, which I know we're not really talking about right now, but one of the things that struck me is when we look at the trend, engagement and academic challenge go down together. Is that something we see in national data?
I don't know that we have national trend data for Youth Truth.
Okay. It would just, like, my assumption would be that when you're not academically challenged, you disengage. But also the thing that stands out to me when we talk about in our schools, students feeling like we don't challenge them, but then the mostly A group is the largest portion. And not saying that it was right when I went to school, but I had a professor that was the bell-shaped curve, and he would not give more than 5 or 10% of the class A's. Like I said, not saying that's right, but it seems like when we're having our kids say they don't feel challenged, but half of them are getting A's, that's a problem, I think.
Yeah, so one thing I'll add, there is no shortage of data, not just around the country, but around the world, of student surveys where students say they're not challenged enough. So I can't speak to a 3-year trend necessarily, but that is an issue worldwide. I can say that with confidence.
I think just building on the GPA thing, I was really surprised at how low the Bs were. Like, I think I would have expected like As and Bs to be more at the top. And so just seeing that dramatic sort of correlation so quickly, like even if you're getting mostly Bs, you feel far less on all of these categories than As. I thought that was interesting.
And keep in mind, we pulled out the least academic questions from Youth Truth. So, I mean, if you add those in.
Right.
If we're looking at things that might be worthy to examine further as a board, a couple of pieces come to mind. One in a positive, and I'm curious about it, is just as students get older, our LGBTQ plus students they're increasing in the percentiles. And so I'm just a little curious about that and what the climates are at the middle school and high school levels. But I think my biggest one that I walked away from was the drop with our special education students that go from 62 to 42 between middle school and high school. And I think if we look at attendance and suspension data for that subgroup and graduation data for that subgroup, what's happening for our students with special needs, because that's a pretty precipitous drop between the two.
And it's similar for ELL. I noticed, especially obviously that 9 around relationships, but like ELL students in elementary school have pretty high scores on most of those, and that drops pretty precipitously in high school as well.
Yeah, and on that one, I wondered, Carrie, whether those are students now that are newcomers, or are they long-term language learners now, which then could affect their satisfaction levels and engagement levels. Yeah, so I had looked at EL, but I had those other questions about who those ELs were.
And Dave, the thing for me that I looked at the most was that looking at the change from high school, from middle school to high school in terms of the students who Cs and Ds, how that number increased. And are they choosing other options? Are they going online? Are they doing credit recovery? What are they doing to be able to, because I noticed also their scores, were, especially with the relationship piece, are they disengaging? Are they not just coming to school at all? Like, what are they doing? Like I said, I would love to look at those things too, in terms of understanding where they're at, and especially with a system of a long game. That's what we're looking at.
I thought when we're thinking about implications for the work of the school board, that over the past couple of years, we've talked a lot about race, partially because that's data we have on the academic side. And just noting here that gender identity is in most cases, either those students are feeling even worse on these measures than students of color, or similarly. So just being aware that even though we don't always have the data to talk about the gender identity on other measures, that's clearly these students are struggling.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a good comment. And one thing I would add to that is when most conversations around subgroups in education tend to focus on one aspect of it and not look at the intersectionality. So what if you look at persons of color, free and reduced versus not free and economic disadvantage or not? So when you start to combine these things, the picture can change pretty drastically as well. I know ODE has played around with a little bit of that. I've been doing a little bit of that type of work with some of our data where it's available. And I think one of the things we're seeing is this is like talking about a subgroup is a huge step forward from what we used to do, but it's still pretty blunt and not necessarily as accurate as we could be if we were able to get a little bit more refined in looking at the interaction of one or two or three of these variables.
Dave, one of the conversations that Laura and I had spoke to the correlation between students' perceptions of their relationships specific to with their teachers at both levels compared to their relationships with their peers. And then we talked a little bit about how inclusion now, which is just a generalized statement about whether or not the student feels an experience that is of value in their school experience, and how, like, for example, in the high school, students who self-identify as LGBTQ+, and students who self-identify as not LGBTQ+, their relationships with their teachers were essentially the same scores. But if you look at the peer-to-peer connections with students who self-identify as LGBTQ+ at the middle school, and those that that identify as not LGBTQ+, that disparate difference between those two demonstrate, like, to me, that screams for better education, better training, better programming at the middle schools to help students start to figure that out.
Yep.
But then you look at those same students that do at the middle school that self-identify as LGBTQ+, they scored relatively high on their feeling of a sense of feeling valued in the school at 56. And so there's some unpacking there that just really makes my brain itch.
And the thing I looked at too is as a board, in terms of I know we're not talking about the challenge of rigor and stuff like this, but are we gonna make the shift in terms of trying to make sure we engage with industry and trying to find other ways for them to be able to have their education in cooperation with the community, right? Because think about it, as things start to shift and change, students will realize they have other options, like, your college options, the different pieces and stuff like this. They can go into apprenticeships, so forth and so on. As a board, where are we at in terms of making sure that they can make that shift seamlessly and feeling like, hey, I can go into whatever I need to.
Yep.
Do you happen to know if you didn't do boys and girls columns? I'd be curious. I just read of boys and men, and wow, I think we have some real reasons to be concerned about our boys. So
Yeah.
I'd just be curious.
Yeah, and that's not just here. That's a issue all over. And one thing I should be clear about is this is not comprehensive. There are many other groups that are not included in this as well. This was just a few of the our high priority groups, but there are certainly, gender is certainly one, and there are others as well. Economics also is another one that is worth looking at, but that's harder to capture with this, with Youth Truth, because students don't always know, for example, whether they receive free and reduced lunch or not. There's another really interesting question that Youth Truth asks. It's about parents' level of education, and the question is essentially, your parent who is has gone through the most school, how much education do they have? And there's a pretty sizable percentage of students who have no idea apparently how much education that their parents have. So I think that could be rich, but there's some gaps in that as well. All right.
I think, I was going to say, my one last piece would be just in terms of our subgroups and working on subgroups, I think that it is notable for us as a board that our largest subgroup, which is our LGBTQ plus students, percentage-wise, is also the group of students that is at the furthest end of feeling a strong sense of culture, belonging, inclusion at both levels.
Yep. All right, so we are going to do the exact same thing with family data. So now what you see is we have 3 levels. We have elementary at the top, we have middle school in the middle, and high school at the bottom. And other than that, the coding is exactly the same. So greens are typical to above, pinks are below average, blues are gaps, and they're still sorted by average percentiles. So I'll set the timer for another 5 minutes and then check in with how we're doing. That is 5 minutes. Would you like more time? Otherwise, it's the same two questions. What potentially important information do you see in these data, and what implications might this have for the work of the board?
I would say one of the pieces that jumps out at me, just in terms of mission, vision, initiative, strategic work, is how low the engagement and communication and feedback scores are at all 3 levels for families, and what we could be doing to better engage, communicate and partner with our families at the elementary, middle, and high school level, because it's always under 50%.
I just think it can be important to name what is working so that we continue to prioritize it so that you don't lose it. And I was just struck by how often the historically underserved group has higher scores than the not historically underserved. And so clearly there is some really great work going on at our schools to make families feel, engaged and that there's a strong culture, even if they speak Spanish or are LGBTQ or free and reduced lunch even. So appreciation for that, and want to keep it as a priority.
Dave, the thing that stood out for me the most is feedback, communications at all levels. Because, I hear it from a lot of parents too, is the feedback, and is the consistent feedback, or is it transparency in terms of what happens in terms of certain pieces? And I can, just based on relationships that I have with a lot of families, especially at the middle school and high school level, it seems like it's very consistent to what, parents have said.
I will say that the other piece I wonder about, I'm looking at the elementary and I'm looking at the high. I think we'd be remiss in not naming how much turnover we've had at the middle schools when we look at the middle school data, because even with those places where we're shining, it's like elementary, yes, middle drop, high school, yes, but we had a tremendous amount of turnover and some pretty hard turnover in one of the schools that has some of the highest populations of subgroups.
Was engagement not a theme for students?
Engagement was a theme for students. Yep, we reported out on that with Board End 1.
Oh, okay.
It was typically focused on academic engagement.
Yeah. Engaged.
I will give a shout out to Kenzie Martin, because our Spanish-speaking families do have really high rates, and I am curious I'm curious on a couple of things, but we've done a lot of really deliberate work in this district targeted at engaging our Spanish-speaking families, and so I think that that's great to see those results.
Absolutely, and with a big drop in high school though, compared to elementary and middle school. So what's happening at high school?
Yeah, we see kind of the same thing across levels with families that we do with students in terms of pretty much any measure you will do, it tends to drop as students get older.
Yeah, in my mind, with those families, I kind of wanted to start understanding how many of these families are in our dual immersion program. Our dual immersion program isn't all the way through high school yet. I mean, I started wanting to know more about the group and these scores. I don't know if that makes sense, but just whether there's different pieces and if people are in certain programs in our district, do they have higher levels of engagement, satisfaction, et cetera. And part of that from the communication. I was just thinking about when I walk into a school as a Spanish speaker, my rating of communication and feedback is going to be a lot higher if I'm in one of our I would assume in one of our dual immersion schools or in a school where there are multiple Spanish speaking faculty.
And Dave, I got a question on the resources piece. Is there any other subsets of those resources in what they're saying they are? Or is it saying if you need a translator, or is it I need a therapist, or do I need a counselor? Is that resource, is that part of that
so
equation?
I honestly, I don't remember the specifics of all the questions, but I'm happy to, I think you already have copies of all the questions.
Yeah, I think we
so,
do, but that's evidence. I couldn't remember.
I'd be
Sorry.
happy to share them if you don't, but yeah.
Yeah, if I remember, it was just a really general, like, do you feel like your school has the resources it needs to serve your student or something like that? Noticing a little bit of an inverse between the students and families where our students who identify as LGBTQ are on the lowest, and with our families that identify as people of color are the lowest, and LGBTQ is a little bit higher. So just noticing, not sure what
Yeah,
to
I
make
think
of it.
one thing you see with the families is, again, if you were coming at it from the lens of predicting that if you're in a traditionally or historically underserved group, you would predict lower outcomes, you don't see that consistently with families. There's a lot of breaking those trends. And again, the thing we have to always wrestle with is families are a much less captive audience than we have with staff and students, so response rates are much lower. And then, who are the people who are choosing to respond and who are the ones who are not choosing to respond?
Except for with people of color, right? Like you see a
Yeah.
lot of interesting stuff, and then it's like, but still, parents
Yes.
of color, very, very bottom.
That sticks out for sure.
What was our response rate this year for families?
So I didn't calculate an estimated percentage just because it's not super exact, but I just eyeballing this, I would guess it's gonna be in somewhere in the 30% range. And what Youth Truth typically tells us is if you get over 20%, you're doing quite well with families.
So one thing that I noticed from elementary to middle school, well, even if we look at the students, like relationships is clear, which is probably why we had that pre-read. But it's also consistent, like it's interesting that it's also consistent from students and as they develop throughout the school, and also parents. If we're looking at the entire, all families from elementary, in relationships, we go from 76, right? 76 dropping to 44. Like that's a major jump. And I guess I'm interested to see, well, one, what are the items that make up the theme of relationships? And then I know I'm going up the ladder, but I would like to see like what do those practices or what do those relationships look like in middle school versus middle school, because then when you get to high school and you go from middle school to high school, there's only a 3% difference, and who knows, that we don't even know if that's real, right? Like that, I mean, are any of these statistically significant or?
We don't have the capacity.
Okay.
These are, we can't run statistical significance because we don't have the raw data. We just get aggregations of it and summaries.
Okay, so then there could potentially not even be a difference from middle school to high school. So to me, we need to look at what's going on from elementary to middle school.
I could join you on that ladder if you'd like, but I think one of the things that is a pretty clear, remember, relationships talks about how students perceive or families perceive their connections to their teachers. One of the really substantial differences in the variables is that one student typically has one or two teachers at the elementary level.
Right.
They have much, much fewer. And so there's much more likelihood of being connected to when you're one of 26
Yep.
students.
Then one of
Whereas when you're
150.
a secondary teacher, and I would say that you're probably seeing a fairly consistent data set, 6 through 12 there, that the students and families who are speaking to us about their connections to their teachers when they're one of 150 of a population that's connected to a teacher probably isn't going to be received as high. And so we're inferring all of this, of course, but I think that's a variable that's worthy of consideration, and that's about as financially feasible of a model as we have at the secondary level to be able to make it work on this. So one of the things we've talked about is I don't think we disaggregated this data in this fashion last year, and I think it would be important for us to continue to disaggregate it the way we're seeing it now, because I think we could learn on whether or not initiatives and points of emphasis that we're taking is actually turning the needle on any of these areas. You see places where and you think about this population, right? Like these are families who are engaged enough to fill out. This is our highest 30% of families who are giving us feedback. And one of the takeaways, immediate takeaway, is they're telling us that we're not doing as well as we potentially could with communication and providing feedback to them. And so I think that's a real takeaway for me and my team. And I would like us to think about what that might look like as we think about our goals for next year.
I
Most
think just
definitely.
like
Go ahead, Sherry. Carrie. Go.
just a really quick, gentle push on the variable that you raised is absolutely, of course, that's probably what's causing this number. But the variable is also a choice. Like it's our choice to not have advisors or to not, try to make sure that each student has one or family has a primary contact or whatnot. So it's a variable, but it's also something we can play with and look at the data and say, boy, this variable is not having a positive impact on the data. How could we play with that variable and not just take it as a given?
Dave, did you look at this data like at each middle school?
Yes.
So did you see any certain school, middle, I guess, or high school standing above the rest, or is the data pretty consistent between schools?
No, so I would say, again, there's more than 1 million data points across 3 years, so it's like, it's an awful lot to consume. One thing that we see fairly consistently, not on every question or every theme, but we see spread. So if you picture, you've got a horizontal scale, you've got schools here, you've got schools here, and you have everything in between. So that is a common theme. So what you are looking at is a district summary, but there's a lot of nuance happening at the different schools in terms of some are doing better on one type of question, and others are doing better on another question. And again, from a systems and improvement standpoint, it's like when you see a lot of spread, that means there's inconsistency and not focus in trying to guide what our work looks like. If we're all doing the same thing and focused on something, you would see that spread shrink considerably. And there are areas we have that and areas that we don't. And again, with 1 million plus data points, I can't remember exactly where all of them are, but it's, certainly.
I think you told us that the individual school data did go back to
Yeah.
the schools. And was it at this level of detail
So
for each school?
every school has access to this level of detail. It's not displayed in a heat map like this, but if you remember the charts that we looked at in Board End 1 or 2 or in previous years where you can, the kind of the blue and the orange, every school has access to that for every demographic group possible.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, go ahead, Amy.
I was just wondering from an operational perspective, if we're seeing like one school is doing great with engagement, are we looking at why so that we can spread that to other schools?
Yeah.
Might not necessarily be a question for you, that
I-
might
and I
be more
certainly
directed to
wouldn't-
Dr.
I wouldn't
Cook.
name a school right now because I don't have the data in front of me, but yeah. We certainly, I look at that.
And
I think, whoop, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And for me, the answer to the second question, implications that might, like I said, might information and work in the school board as a board, how can we help support our staff in terms of with the engagement relationship piece? How can we help them be able to be more engaged with the families in general? Like, what can we do to help support what that looks like? What is those things we can put in place, especially when we start looking at our goals for next year? And so forth and so on. So how do we support them is one of the things that popped up for me in those two areas. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Apologies. I was just going to say, kind of connect what Amy was saying and what Carrie was saying earlier, which is, and this comes from me being a huge fan of professional learning communities and the work of the DeFores, but is really highlighting, being able to have principals sitting in a room together and highlighting what they've done and shining a light and being able to share best practice. Because I think there are great things, and I happen to think my principal's doing a really strong job with his communication this year. And so just those opportunities, I'm excited for our principals to be able to look at this data together as well.
One of the things that occurs to me too, especially after reading the document that you shared with us, happy teachers make happy kids. How simple can that be? But as we continue to work on the whole relationship and the academic excellence and the professional learning for our staff, I think those pieces are really tied together. And Laura, I think, the strides that the district has made in the last several years in terms of professional development and academic knowledge. We all know that first year, we didn't know anything. College didn't really prepare us to be a great teacher. But that professional development piece just cannot go unrecognized. And again, with turnover of staff, with turnover administration, I'd like to see or be a part of some kind of discussion about what are the next steps in professional development that will help us support the relationship and engagement and academic excellence, and how do individual teachers be aware of that and be comfortable with it and know that they're working on it.
Well, and I'll say, Shirley, I think that also plays into the conversations we've been having around student behavior in the classroom, right? Our teachers need to feel safe in their classroom and they need to feel supported in their classroom. And right now, a lot of our teachers don't. And there's a lot of work to do around that topic. And yes, our educators have to be mentally well to do their job well. We all know this. Everyone sitting here has had a bad day where it's like, yeah, I'm not my best self today, and I'm not really able to serve other people if you work in a job where you serve people. And our educators are serving students every day. They have to be well to do that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I mean, through this discussion, it actually doesn't surprise me that relationships are the least favorable in this data set, considering what teachers are going through right now. And I imagine, with the task force that was recently created, I'm curious to see, well, also to what Amy was saying, when more support is given to teachers, will that relationship score increase? Or will it be more favorable as a result? I mean, I'm guessing it is, because teachers can actually engage with students, have those getting to know students. At different programs, students, high schoolers, they tell us they don't want to be seen as just another student. They want to be seen, they want people to they want educators and staff to get to know them. But if educators and staff are constantly, being interrupted, it's hard to do that other piece.
Well, you'll all be thrilled that we'll be talking about staff data in a month. So, well, I mean, we'll have, because we'll go through the staff youth truth and whatever the new Oregon survey is, I think we'll have those data back, maybe too, so
Is there-
Oregon statewide educator survey.
here we go.
Is there a reason why we look at the data in a staggering way versus like this is a presentation showing high level? I'm just curious why the time in between that we look at the results.
Are you asking the lag between when the survey happens and when we look at the data?
No, just even when being presented with the results. Like you saying next month we'll look at the
Oh.
teacher data, like why don't we look at it all together?
I got it. So this data is actually called out in our goals specific to student experience, and this is part of goal 3. And the staff data is not specifically called out in one of the first 3 goals are student outcome goals. And so we're presenting the staff data almost as a follow-up to create the dialogue about are there connections between the student outcome data
Yeah.
and the staff outcome data. And so right now, there isn't a board goal as it relates to efficacy of staff. If that's something the board is interested in, that's another conversation.
And I'd also add, one of the reasons, Keena, that we split this one, I mean, obviously, there's a lot to talk about just in looking at students and families, but we don't have the Oregon Educator Survey results back yet, so we thought it might make sense to separate that when we had then both those measures to talk about that.
Thank you.
And I will say, as a board, we don't have measures yet for Goal 4. And we know that we have each of those. I hope everybody's had a chance to give their feedback on the ELs. But we have each of those ELs in Group 4. And so there's an opportunity for measures to be added to that one, and a staff measure could be one of those.
All right. I'm done, so it's all up to you if you have more to say. It's a great conversation, though. So much interesting data.
Are there any further questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. This has to sit for a while in my head, and go over and over again with the student data, again with the staff data. The task force is working on something or some things that are certainly tied to this data. Our school level plans have been tightened, is that a right word, Laura? So that the schools are being held accountable to face some of the ahas that they have had in their planning. Administrative leadership, again, with, I lost count, with all of our school administrators. They have to be held accountable to not only understand the data, but to do something with it in a positive way, whether that's in their own individual evaluation plan, or I'm not sure what that means. And the board has to be accountable now that we have this level of data and we're seeing the trends, and we've got a fabulous possibility of laying things out now that we can understand instead of just making guesses. The board really has to be accountable, not just as we do those ELs, but as we look at every bit of this data and moving into next year for our plans and our targets and our strategies. I think we can be very direct, if that's the right word, about addressing some of these issues that we're now seeing.
All right. So for the public, they may wonder what's next. Well, we have all of this data for a reason, and that is really, it keeps us apprised of where, how our students and our staff and our families are experiencing our schools. It gives us data against the goals that we've established for the district. But most importantly, it gives Superintendent Cook and his team data to work with as they make their plans for their strategic initiatives for the following year. And so we'll be looking at that in the future. And want to just thank you, Dave, for bringing this to us and bringing us the pre-read as well. I want to give a shout out to Dan Cotton, who's in there. He's mentioned in the article, and it was very fun. I took a picture, so hello, Dan. But anyway, I went to high school with him. Thank you very much. I'm really excited about this work. We will move, excuse me, into
Can I just
board-
say, sorry, can I just say one more quick thing? I would just, well, first of all, I would love to hear, I wish I could be like a fly on the wall and hear our principals and teachers talk about this data and what they think and say. But also just want to encourage our schools to go back to students. Like you said a lot of times, like, we don't know exactly why students said that or what they meant. Like, we can ask them. And so just making sure to engage students, perhaps the Student Voice Committee, Board Committee, just really bringing them into the conversation about like what this tells us and what we can do about it.
I also want to say one more thing. Just as the teachers came forward to talk about behavioral issues that they're dealing with in the classroom, and we consider what can we, and they're saying, please take something off of our plates. We are dealing with so much. And then when we see data like this, and the conversation tends to revolve on what can we now do in response to it? Let's keep adding. So as we think, and I'm terming out, so this will be a conversation for all of you to discuss, but that conversation of what can we take away, what isn't working, it really focusing on the things that are working to balance that, because I do feel like the conversation continues to be, let's keep more programs, new initiatives, more things on the teachers' plates, and at some point we really need to be cognizant, I think we already are, but even more so, of how much we are putting a strain on the system. This data is phenomenal, but it does tend to drive forward that need to do more, and it is harmful. So just my take.
We'll now open it to board comments. We will start with Director Olson.
Just a reminder that the Education Foundation is holding their big fundraiser next week, Wednesday night, the trivia night. I have never attended one, so I'm not exactly sure how it goes. But I do believe there's some high levels of competition between different groups, teams, and it should be fun to watch. So next Wednesday night at Silver Moon Brewing, 6:30.
Just two quick things. I attended the High Desert ESD Budget Committee meeting with Dr. Cook last week, I believe, and just a couple of highlights. They, like us, are worried about the end of ESSER funds and some, one-time funding that will no longer be available. They're concerned about the budget being underfunded in one of their main categories. Steve, you might know of $9 million underfunded, and are busy advocating to the state legislature so that won't be underfunded. I think one of the most interesting things that I heard from them was that they're really taking the approach of, instead of just dealing with the budget they get, they're really trying to look at what do the communities that they serve need? And if there isn't government funding, then they're going out and trying to get grant funding to be able to do the work. And the percentage of their budget that is now grant funded versus government funded is a pretty dramatic shift over the last couple of years. So they just noted that that is a real culture change for them to just sort of take the approach of this needs to be done, so we're going to go out and find the money. And because they expressed some concern about budget shortfalls in the future, I did ask if they had any plans to increase the percentages that they charge districts like ours, and they said they did not, so that was good to hear. So that was good. I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, Dr. Cook. And then, or yes, no?
I would just add that they are in the same boat that all of us are, which is at 9.9 billion, the allocation that's currently earmarked. That is a service level drop, and we are dealing with building a budget on less funding than we are currently receiving, and so stay tuned.
Yeah. And then I also attended an SBA a couple weeks ago. I have a summary that I'm typing up and materials to share with lots of different departments. It was quite a bit smaller this year, and I really felt like the quality of the sessions had gone downhill personally, but there were several really good ones on the impact of boards on student success, which I will share with all of you. I went to several on retaining teachers, educator engagement and retention that I'll share with Steve Heron, and went to a couple more interesting sessions on student voice that I'm sharing with Jackie, and some interesting sessions on civility and parents' rights in education. So happy to share that all with you, and thank you for the opportunity to continue to grow and learn as a board member. That's it.
After our last meeting, we had a presentation by by our lead folks, lead teachers, and today I had the opportunity to sit in on one of Amy Zibnewski's classes, and it was really interesting to read the pre-read, and it was also really great to see that she's doing a lot of the best practices that are in that pre-read. So yeah, it was pretty cool to see how engaged the students were, and yeah.
Great, a few pieces. One wonderful time cooking breakfast in Lapine for the Lapine High School and transportation staff. I was also able to go to the City Club City Managers meeting with all the city managers from the region. It was also the same day that point of time counts came out, and just an important statistic for our community to know, 12% of our homeless population are under the age of 18. So they are our students, they are our children. I also was able to go down to support our nurses yesterday, and I think that one of the main things that our nurses are asking for is respect, and that is exactly what our teachers are asking for as well. And so I just really want to emphasize in our community every time I get interviewed, they say, is there anything you want to ask? I'm like, yes, go thank a teacher, respect your teachers. They are working so hard, so please do that. Fourth piece is I am very excited and thankful for Deschutes County and going into a third year, I think it's third year of our Healthy Schools partnership. I just got to sign the letter, but it has just been an amazing partnership and pilot program to do a 50-50 split on the cost of bringing counselors into our schools to help our kids make healthy choices. I think we've really seen the impact of that, especially around things like vaping and suicide prevention. And then last, I want to encourage people to remember that we do have a special election coming up, It is May 16th. Today is the last day to register to vote for that election, so if you haven't registered, please do. And then specific to our roles as a school board, on Wednesday and Thursday, City Club, along with the League of Women Voters, is running a forum, so you have the opportunity to hear from the people that are running to represent you on this board. So that is an opportunity for our public to tune into. And that is it. With that said, our next regular school board business meeting is scheduled for May 9th, 2023, and this meeting is adjourned.